Can you retrospect on a year-old game? Maybe. You can retrospect on your day before bed, so I don't see why not, I guess. Halo Infinite is the newest game in Microsoft's juggernaut Halo franchise, and the 7th mainline game so far, counting Reach, a prequel at 0. The game kinda follows up on the previous title, Halo 5 Guardians, and was simultaneously released on the Xbox Series X and S and PC. Its multiplayer component is free to play, albeit scummy as hell, which is not going over well, while its campaign is the purchasable part of the game, and while not scummy, it is frustrating in ways. There's times when I love it and times where I'm confused, irritated, or just angry. It's a messy game with fun mechanics, strong highs, and a lot of lows. I love and hate it. My feelings are messy, and in some ways it's because Halo Infinite is. But the gameplay sure as hell ain't. Halo's had an identity crisis since 3. Its first 3 games had the same core gameplay, while the games following have all attempted to add something. Reach had armor abilities, 4 shifted the gameplay to be faster paced with sprinting, attempting to emulate its at-the-time replacement, Call of Duty, but Infinite has something gold. Largely, Halo Infinite is your standard first-person shooter, and maintains some of those classic Halo quirks. Jumps are high, shields regenerate fast, weapons are very satisfying, enemies are smart, but this time Master Chief has a few new tools, pretty genius ones if I do say so. First, the ability to pick up coils, explosive canisters in the environment that can be thrown, a really fun addition to the typical grenades and guns, but also in 4 gadgets that are unlocked throughout the campaign, each of which has upgrades to further extend their usability. The threat sensor, a type of sonar that can be launched like a bullet in an arc, that highlights enemies in the area it lands through walls for its duration, not only allowing for greater planning, but also serving to counter enemies made mostly invisible by active camouflage, who can be more frequently utilized because of this. The drop wall, a temporary shield that can be placed anywhere for cover in bad situations. The thruster, a very fast dash that can go in any direction to quickly avoid attacks. And the best of all, the grapple shot. The grapple shot is genius. A multi-purpose tool that ups the pace, rewards aggression, but also serves to add options to movement and defense. The uses the game squeezes out of a mid-range grappling hook are pretty immense. The obvious is for making getting around more fun and giving a quick escape option, but it shatters the usual Halo, hell, the usual FPS loop of shoot until shields are low, crouch under cover, pop out and repeat. Approach on the grappling hook is fast enough to move in through enemy fire to get close, and that's just using it for movement. It's a weapon too. When it strikes an enemy, it temporarily stuns them, drags Chief to them, and increases melee damage based on the speed he's moving. An amazing approach for aggressive play. On Jackals, who wield shields, while the grapple shot can't pierce it, bouncing off it staggers little bastards, letting Chief grapple to them properly or shoot them, plus less common usages, like grabbing weapons from a distance. Upon getting the upgrade that reduces its cooldown, it can be used to basically scale anything. You can fire it fast enough that you can just go uppies. Oh yeah, upgrades. They come from Spartan Core spread across the open world. That's new and different, but maybe not so much so. Halo always had sprawling levels, wide areas, and the Zeta Halo isn't so different, and if it was navigated solely by foot, even by vehicle, it might wear on me. But the grapple shot is so much fun to get around with. As far as open worlds go, something I'm not a fan of over tight linear games, I think it's really solid. Drop dead gorgeous, tons of verticality. I played on Heroic where enemies are pretty brutal, and sometimes had more fun creatively going around them than I did actually fighting them. Those well-designed tight levels are still there, and they usually drop you off relatively near the start of your next one if you're only interested in moving through the campaign. But the side content that's available is pretty great too. Some of it is relatively throwaway. Marine rescues and forward operating bases are relatively uneventful, although FOBs are useful in creating new fast travel points and allowing Master Chief to spawn any weapons and vehicles he wants. But the enemy bases and high-value targets are a treat. Bases are complex miniature levels swarmed with enemies. Not nearly as creative or flashy as the story missions, but with varied designs, intense combat from all sides, and some valor to unlock new weapons at FOBs. They usually also have a Spartan Core as a reward as well, while high-value targets are mini-bosses spread throughout the world. They're tough, cruel usually. On Heroic, they'll easily two-shot you, but have the health of a tank and some masochistic gimmicks with their signature weapons, a permanently invisible elite with an energy sword that boosts his speed, a brute with an even more powerful gravity hammer, a brute with a mangler, which is a sort of mid-range revolver shotgun combo that shoots burst fire, and a ton more. Insane, brutal monsters, but knocking one down permanently unlocks their signature weapon variant at FOBs, expanding build variety. They can be maddeningly tough, but man are they worth it. Bosses in general pose issues for this game. I do think generally they're too bulky. While I love the rewards, the dynamic, on Heroic at least, of dumping 1,000 rounds into something that kills you in seconds can be a little tedious, especially when it comes to the limited tools available in the linear areas, but I'll come back to some of the worst of that later. It's a nice attempt at incorporating bosses into the series, which the series has never done well at, but the balancing is a bit off. There's also various other things to find: Forerunner artifacts, audio logs, Spartan armories, which unlock cosmetics for multiplayer. There's a lot to find in a game that's pretty fun to traverse. Shockingly, I have more issues with the way linear levels play out than the open world. I'd be remiss not to touch on the most basic part of what makes an FPS fun: the shooting. Infinite nails both basic elements. The shooting is fun on its own, and the enemies are fun to shoot. Weapon feels incredible as ever, and the variety is great. The battle rifle was my favorite. Anytime I could, I used it, but the carbine, mauler, shotgun, sword, sentinel laser, all very fun. The weapon dynamic is great. Like Master Chief, many enemies have shields. Plasma weapons, wielded primarily by opponents, shred shields, while ballistic weaponry, primarily wielded by the human USNC, tends to do badly on shields, but kill quickly on unarmored enemies. There's also Forerunner tech, which appears more sparingly, and usually has both weirder properties and a more even effect on flesh and shields, leading to a strong dynamic where the two weapon slots are best filled with different weapon types and combined. There's also electric-based weapons, which don't come up much. They deal damage over time on hits, and they disable vehicles. Enemies are also fantastic. Halo has always done well in this regard, not just in fun lines the enemies say, but in fun and challenging AI. With each unique species having its pros and cons, and the AI playing pretty smart to force the player out, rush them down, or throw them off. The most basic enemies are grunts. They die to pretty much anything. It's rare that they have shields, but despite this, they can add on to dangerous situations, doing heavy shield damage with plasma pistols, tossing grenades, and even just going full suicide bomber. A step up is jackals, who carry shields. As I said, the grapple shot is a fun tool for dealing with them. Here they often do some backup as rank fillers, but also often as snipers. Lots of snipers, constant snipers. Every level. They kill you very fast. It can be a lot. The snipers aren't fun to deal with, and I could have done with less. Although credit where it's due, you are given a lot of warning when being targeted. The red flare on your vision, the glint on their scope in the distance to help locate them. Skimmers are a new enemy. They're flying little bastards that almost exclusively use snipers. This game loves snipers. Sentinels also exist. They're a different breed of flying little thing that appear more and more as the game progresses. Forerunner robots that generally spam lasers. Brutes are the muscle of the enemy forces. Only the high-ranked ones have shields, but even the lower-ranked ones are hardy, using helmets that have to be shot off before headshots and absorbing a ton of punishment, and dealing it out hard with heavy explosive weaponry, as well as charging in for brutal melee. Hunters are rare, but they always come in pairs. Colonies of worms in heavy armor. They can only be damaged by aiming for their few exposed areas, or by removing the armor from their backs, as well as through the use of heavy weaponry, explosives, or the skewer, which pierces armor. They have heavy cannons, they like to watch each other's back, and they go into a rage at low health and charge Chief. They're very vicious, honestly perhaps too much so in this game given their speed, which makes them huge pain to deal with. And finally, elites are the most varied enemy. Like Master Chief, they can carry two weapons, usually a plasma sword for up close and something else for range. They all have shields, and higher ranked ones have active camo, making them mostly invisible. There's a ton of variety in enemy placement and map design. The core gameplay is fantastic. The ground floor of Halo Infinite is fantastic as a whole. Every complaint I have was more on specifics, bits and pieces that are obnoxious. Well, and the snipers. There's a lot of fucking snipers in this game. Halo Infinite is a hell of a looker. Bungie was always great at skyboxes, and 343 doesn't disappoint in that area. Every time I hit somewhere new, I had to stop and admire for a little bit. The way the ring world curves into the distance, the stars, it's gorgeous. There's a fascinating style to Zeta Halo as well. The ring is artificially constructed, and it shows, with giant metallic pylons and edges that just drop into space. Space below, space above, but with every imaginable terrain between. Even on the fairly limited areas of the ring you explore, comprising a solid handful of islands, there's a lot of variety. Particle effects are really slick with lovely explosions and shots, beautiful modeling and animation all around on enemies too. Skimmers spinning out when shot down, brutes leaping about. I'm easily impressed by big fancy graphics because I don't play a lot of modern AAA games, but I was pretty blown away. The few cutscene cinematics in the game are also incredibly impressive, the opening one especially, very, very good looking. As for music, the classic Halo theme is still incredible and the rest is fine. Nothing stands out as very memorable, but I think it sets the mood in the right places. Intense, the battle themes are high energy, the cutscene music can hit those somber moments when it needs to. I don't really remember a lot specifically beyond the main theme and that one intense song that goes on when the big action hits, which also comes from earlier games. Also, this didn't really fit anywhere better, but the lack of co-op in the campaign is a shame. I imagine it was in part due to the open world, but still, co-op was a staple of the series and a part of what helped it grow like it did, so it's kind of a shame to see it go. Alright, Halo lore dump time, just to get us caught up. Spoilers for most of the series, but, you know, a little bit necessary to understand what the fuck is going on. Okay, pre-Halo, a long time ago, the Forerunners were advanced aliens doing life and stuff, thinking that the dudes who came before, the precursors, left them something called the mantle, guardianship of the galaxy. But it turns out the precursors were kind of just doing their own thing and made something called the Flood Cell, a cell that possesses and assimilates everything into its hive mind, dead or alive. This, as it turns out, was kinda a bad thing, so the Forerunners constructed what is called the Halo Array, which turns any creature above a certain size and intelligence into goo, and they completely terminated intelligent life in the galaxy to starve out the increasingly powerful Flood. Fast forward a good long while, and humans are around, as are the Covenant, an alliance of all the aliens I talked about except the Skimmers, led by religious leaders called the Reformists, who were too stupid to finish reading the Halo Array instruction manual, and believed that setting it off would be a transcendence to godhood. Also, they really didn't like humans for shattering their belief that they were the only life in the universe. Halos 1 through 3 are about John 117, the Master Chief, a Spartan, which are genetically modified superhumans, going to stop this with his AI waifu Cortana. After all this is dealt with, we get to the more relevant stuff. Halo 4, nobody cares what happens, some Forerunner guy wakes up and does some stuff, Cortana dies. Halo 5 Guardians, Cortana's actually alive, but she's bad now. She takes the mantle for herself and wants to become a tyrannical dictator to force peace. She kinda wrecks the aliens and humans both and leaves things in a bad state. Halo Wars 2, yes, the spin-off real-time strategy game is canon and arguably more important than 4 and 5. Without the Covenant, Atriox, a brute, has created his own faction of mercenaries and warriors from the Covenant remains called the Banished. I haven't played Halo Wars 2, but he's the main villain of Halo Infinite, so here we are. There's also like 5 books, and I have no idea how many comics. It's too confusing for me to work out which of these are actually relevant to Halo Infinite. There's like 100 books, but only like 5 of them are related in some way. Here's what I think happens in them. The Banished keep doing stuff and eventually team up with Cortana, who's still doing the evil dictator thing, and then she dies. Halo Infinite picks up from 4 killing Cortana and 5 making her Space Hitler, with her having died off screen in a way that isn't explained until later. And that's about where we start off. We know nothing, the status quo is completely reversed from the last game, and now we can finally get to the actual game. Well, the game technically begins slightly before Cortana's death with a really absolutely amazing cutscene of Master Chief fighting Atriox, who's attempting to take the USNC Infinity, the flagship of humanity's fight around the Zeta Halo, ending in Master Chief being dropped into space. 6 months later, the USNC is in shambles, the Banished have control of Zeta Halo, and Cortana is dead. Master Chief is floating through space in stasis and is picked up by Echo 216, the pilot of the destroyed Pelican, who's clinging onto what's left of the ship's life support and uses what's left to bring back Master Chief. Immediately after, the Pelican is caught in the stasis beam of the Banished warship, the Ghost of Gbraakon, Gbraakon, and Chief jumps through space to the ship. Warship Gbraakon is straightforward and linear, but serves nicely to introduce the new stuff, especially the grapple shot. Some rather important exposition is delivered. Atriox is gone, killed somehow, and his second, Escharum, is taken over, who will be the primary enemies through most of the game. Elites are semi-common, but usually only one a group, Sentinels don't start appearing until the late game, and Hunters are more or less mini-bosses who appear pretty periodically. The end section of the level is a battle on the bridge, in a large 2-floored arena against primarily brutes. It's a really good argument the game makes for learning the grapple shot, because brutes kill really fast, a lot of them have heavy weapons like the Ravager, which just vomits plasma, and if not, they just charge you down. And changing floors in the arena with the grapple shot and using it to get away fast are key. Being Chief, and without Cortana to hack Gbraakon, he just punches the ship's controls to death and blows it up. The escape from the ship is really cool. It's a bit light on actual gameplay, as the ship's destruction clears most enemies, but it looks cool and it's a really exciting set piece, and especially crossing the falling beams and ships in the later parts using the grapple shot, pretty fucking cool. After escaping back to the somewhat repowered Pelican, he's informed that he needs to retrieve the weapon, which is located underneath Zeta Halo. Foundation, the second mission, takes place inside the guts of Zeta Halo. The large hexagonal pillars serve as the foundation of the land masses above. For something set on one island on a planet-sized ring, it certainly has a lot of variety. Elites appear right away, low-ranking, fairly easy ones, but they're still more complex than the rest of the Banished. The terrain under the Zeta Halo is rough, partially due to the damage it sustained during whatever happened to Cortana, which leads to platforming and more required usage of the grapple shot to navigate. You will, by this point, have come to love it, probably so much that you use it too much and get yourself in bad spots. I did this a lot. The weapon isn't a weapon, not in a traditional sense, but an AI like Cortana was. She was designed to capture and eliminate Cortana, and while she did capture her, she didn't kill her and is unaware what happened to her. I think Weapon is great. She's a lot of fun, unlike Cortana, who is sarcastic, dry, and used to life with Master Chief. Weapon is a new AI, naive, cheerful, and optimistic. She's cute and plays well off the completely serious Chief in a way that Cortana didn't. I still like Cortana. It's not an insult to her, I just like this dynamic better. Before leaving the underground area with Weapon, the game throws in the first boss fight at Chief. It's a bit of a shock to come across. Tremonius is an extremely hardy brute. He has a jump pack, which lets him do rocket-powered jumps to Chief and rocket-powered melee attacks. He has a Hydra, which shoots fast explosive projectiles, and the Bulldog, a shotgun. He kills you very, very fast, and the checkpoint starts you with him rocketing towards you immediately as the cutscene ends. He also has 2 advanced Jackals with hardier shields as backup. Bosses not only have extremely high health, but extremely sturdy shields. The grapple hook is a necessity to keep out of reach, and a good loadout of something plasma and something ballistic is going to help. But on heroic or higher, it's going to be a scramble to use every grenade you have and every plasma coil in reach to pop the shield. I'm not going to lie, every boss in this game, this one especially, is frustrating as fuck. It can eventually be kind of satisfying to conquer, but it's just so miserable sometimes. They take ages and ages to wear down and kill you in 2 hits. It's very hard to force a checkpoint against bosses because they're so aggressive and they're always near you, so you just can't. Ugh, it's a pain. It's a pain. I think the idea, kinda good. Execution, not so much. Outpost Tremonius, the first mission on the surface of Zeta Halo, is, I suppose, an introduction to the open world, although there isn't a ton of freedom yet, and you're started exactly where you need to be, so leaving is kind of a waste of time. Outpost Tremonius follows a design similar to the optional bases that can be found later, a small enclosed area with enemies scattered about minding their business. The goal is to clear everything to open up the landing pad. The open areas pose an interesting dynamic challenge. Stepping up from the underground, you got nowhere to go back, and enemies in a semicircle all around you. No matter where you go, you'll be surrounded. It's something you gotta get used to. You have a grapple shot, you need to keep moving. After clearing everything, the landing pad is made available, and Echo meets Weapon. He's not too happy about it considering what Cortana has done, nor is he too happy about being forced to stick around Zeta. The relationship between these 3 serves as the core of the emotional story in Infinite, but I'll come back to that when it's a little more relevant. The mission after Recovery is a further introduction to the open world. You have freedom now and could technically kick around the island. The map in the menu, wow, that's a nice map. Real clean, detailed, but it only shows forward operating bases by default. Small USNC outposts around the map that when captured let Chief spawn unlocked vehicles and weapons and also reveal nearby outposts. USNSC distress signals, high value targets, Spartan cores, and so on. Recovery centers on capturing Fob Gulf, which is just a small combat area as they all are, but Fob Foxtrot is also available and these open up a bunch of stuff. Ransom Keep, an optional outpost, some kind of reclamation facility for salvage, which is an intense assault from all sides, but has a segment where you can roll around in the Scorpion for a little bit, the USNC tank to clean up, which is fun. You don't get to use it a whole lot in this game. The stress calls are simple little areas where Chief can rescue some captured soldiers, and the first 2 high-value targets become available: Briglard, a beefy grunt that uses a modified plasma pistol, and Okro Vagadoon, an extremely difficult to lead who abuses the hell out of active camouflage to stay invisible while using the Duelist Energy Sword, which makes him, or after you obtain it, Master Chief, faster and jump higher. You really don't want to fight this guy right away. You kind of want to wait until you have the sensor, or you'll be blind against an enemy who kills you in 1 to 2 hits. Like the mandatory bosses, these high value targets are tough, but very fucking worth it. I also don't think I'll be going into depth about many more of them. They're all variants on regular enemies. They are much stronger, they take many more hits. They seem to have the same AI as the standard enemies, if not a little more aggressive and intelligent, and they have a special weapon variant, some of which are really good and are definitely worth getting, like the modified carbine that has a higher fire rate. A lot of them kind of aren't worth getting. The tower is a mission that mixes both the open world and linear designs, beginning with the base below the tower. The only goal to get into the tower is to turn on the grav lift, which gives the player some options. Fighting through it is possible, but it's certainly not optimal. The area is stuffed with enemies and more spawn when things start up, specifically charging brutes who can be a bitch when backed up with other enemies. Approaching from the sides can give access to sniper towers and other defensible positions to thin the rank before warming up the gravity lift and entering the tower. It's kinda neat when the freedom of the open world segments gives a lot of options like this, which is something the linear levels can't do nearly as strongly. The tower is dark and foggy, steamy, something. Visibility is low, which makes it convenient that Chief gets the sensor here. The tower is a simple set of hallways that leads upwards, so the path is simple and the sensor is good for seeing around corners, covers most of each floor, and gets good immediate proof of how useful it can be. Besides the grapple shot, it was certainly my most used gadget. It's pretty much always good, it's just giving you information for free. At the top of the tower, Chief finds a living but captured Spartan, but to rescue him he needs to fight the Warden, Shock, Lock, an elite with an energy sword, pulse carbine, and of course active camouflage, the perfect boss for the sensor area. He's as much of a jackass as the other bosses, the sword kills very fast, the room is pretty open, so the grapple shot is pretty necessary to avoid him, meaning switching back and forth between the two gadgets. He's not nearly as bulky as the brute bosses, but closes distance just as well. Like I said, the bosses are fun novelties at times, it can also be frustrating walls that grind progress to a halt a lot of the time. After all the trouble of another boss, the other Spartan immediately dies when freed, which is insanely fucking cliche. He may as well have just been dead from the start because it's a little cheap, but it does inform Master Chief of a dig site that the Banished have made to find something, which gives Master Chief some direction and opens up the other half of the main island, which is pretty much half of the game. The other areas are pretty small. Clearing the tower unlocks the bulk of the game's side content, which is all located in this northern section of the biggest landmass. 5 forward operating bases, 4 outposts, the Horn of Abolition, the Forge of Tish, Redoubt of Sundering, and the Armory of Reckoning, all of which play out more or less like you'd expect, 15 USNC rescue missions, and 5 high-value targets. If you plan on doing all the side content, or even just a bulk of it, you're going to want to do it right now, because after the next mission, you're locked into a few in a row before you can come back to the overworld, and then you're locked into a different part of the overworld later. The Excavation Site starts the next mission chain. Like the tower, it begins with another outdoor section, which is probably the first point in the game that snipers become extremely fucking irritating. The ridges all around the Excavation Site are covered in the fuckers, and everywhere in the center where you are is drowned in enemies. After destroying all the pylons, Master Chief can enter the drill, where before turning it off to enter the cave, he has to fight the Bruce Bassus. He's got a ton of health, a massive shield, and kills you in 1 to 2 swings of his gravity hammer. There's no real good strategy for this boss. The area you fight him in is very cramped, and I got a lucky checkpoint halfway through where I probably never would have beaten him. You grapple shot away, turn around, and shoot a few times. Repeat. There's a skewer kind of close to where you start, which shreds his health, but it's an extremely slow and clunky and difficult to aim weapon to use on a guy who constantly jumps around and attacks you. The Conservatory is that Halo level. It's like the library in Combat Evolved. Lots of hallways and lots of plot dumping. Not to say it isn't good, the gameplay is still great, and there's a lot of great little combat arenas, including the one that introduces the skimmers, which has diagonal gravity lifts to launch you about, which is a lot of fun. Despite being snipers, the flying thing makes them fun to grapple to, and they always die in 1 melee hit. The game starts the skimmers slow since they're new, but ramps them up by adding more and more and then pairing them with charging brutes. It's a pretty neat section. The chapter also gives Chief the final 2 gadgets. Unupgraded, the drop shield is fairly flimsy, but it's a nice tool when exiting a hallway into an open area, giving the player a bit of cover to shoot into rooms. The thruster is neat, but like the drop shield, 1 short speed burst isn't going to be extremely helpful. As it gets upgraded and allows storing multiple charges, as well as reducing cooldown and extending its length, it gets a lot more useful, but I strongly prefer the grapple shot for my avoiding and dodging and moving around. More relevant than the gameplay are the story beats of this chapter. First, meeting 117649 Despondent Pyre, the Monitor of Zeta Halo. Monitors are the Jannies of the Zeta Halo, responsible for protecting it from damage so it can eventually be fired. They go a bit overboard and usually end up in a murderous rage over it, but Pyre is fairly chill. Pyre is concerned about the Banished digging, in part because the Zeta Halo has something sealed within it, something even worse than the Flood allegedly. Also, she doesn't make it out of this one alive. At the end of the chapter, Master Chief also meets the Harbinger, an alien of an unknown species in alliance with the Banished and prompting their digging. The relationship is fairly tenuous, with the Harbinger clearly using the Banished to find whatever's buried, and the Banished are going along with it because she's very powerful. She has quite strong telekinetic powers, which she uses to completely shut down Master Chief's armor, nearly kill him, and toss him out of the Conservatory. She's kinda cool and mysterious here, although actual explanations that come later are questionable. It certainly sets up a lot of potential, but I don't know if I like where it goes. It's also a bit odd, I think. Most of the stuff the other aliens can do is fairly grounded, relatively. The Flood have a hive mind, but are also pretty otherworldly, given that they were created by what effectively are the gods of the Halo universe, while the Harbinger is just a psychic. I know any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, but still it feels a bit odd compared to all the other aliens. The spire begins immediately with the titular spire in the distance, a forerunner tower that is working to restore the functionality of the Zeta Halo. The level is mostly combat. The first hunters appear below the tower, in a pair of course. Hunters are very brutal in this game. They seem faster than ever, and even with explosives and skewers, they take a good while to break down, and getting behind them is tough because of how fucking fast and aggressive they are. Inside is the sub-monitor, a Jutton Resolution. He's fun, teetering on trusting and distrustful at all times. Once he realizes that Master Chief intends to shut down the Spire, he gets pissed and jumps in his mech suit thing for a fight. A robot flying a robot. It's actually perhaps the only good boss fight in the game, which is a little sad, especially given how monitor fights have been historically, which is shooting something that's spamming lasers at you until it dies. I mean, it's still that, but it's been made a bit more interesting. Resolution's mech suit has 4 arms that have glowing spots. Hitting them enough both opens Resolution himself up for damage, but also lowers his damage output. They're fairly small and he hits hard, so it actually serves as a test of accurate aiming. Once the arms are dead, then it becomes a typical monitor fight. His damage output is high, but he's always vulnerable. The stage has enough cover that he's not much of an issue, and just being anything above a damaged, spongy normal enemy is good enough for me at this point. When the tower goes offline, it immediately starts collapsing, which forces Master Chief to call Echo 216, and while they make their escape, the Pelican is immediately shot down by anti-aircraft cannons because Echo kinda sucks. The Pelican crashes in the third open world area here. This chunk is pretty small and you're locked into it, unable to go back until this mission, Pelican Down, is completed. The area lacks FOBs, high value targets, or any other side content, save a couple Spartan cores. It's just to space out the objectives of this mission. The goal is to shut down the 3 anti-aircraft cannons. One of them has its doors wide open and you can stealth right in without a battle, but for the others you need to fight your way to the consoles to turn on the grav lift. The areas around the bases of the core all have their own unique piles of enemies, offering slightly different challenges. My favorite is the one where you can steal Ghost, a small alien vehicle with powerful blasters and a boost for running over enemies, which are very fun to steal using the grapple shot, and very helpful on Heroic because unlimited ammo. Definitely vulnerable to damage, but not as much as Master Chief. Upon breaking all 3 anti-aircraft guns, 2 of the banished best Spartan hunters attack the Pelican and Chief needs to return to save Echo. The area around the Pelican is fairly large, but both bosses are terrible to deal with. If you ever get in a bad position, it's pretty much over. The first brute, Hyperius, rides the chopper, a sort of heavier version of the Ghost, and has a Ravager when he's not on it. Stealing the chopper can be a good dent in him, but his Ravager shreds the vehicle pretty quickly on its own, while the other, Tovaris, uses a jump pack to hop back and forth between raised platforms while shooting a scrap cannon. It's effectively a stronger, slower Ravager that's normally only available as a mounted turret. Both are as strong as any other boss, and if separated are individually really difficult, but more manageable than when they move together. To be fair, the amount of space as well as the various weapons and vehicles in the area, like the Warthog's turret and the chopper, as well as some heavy weapons like the skewer, can put a dent in them, but they both shred vehicles and virtually two-shot Master Chief. The amount of boss fights in this game is, to say the least, extremely exhausting, and this is maybe the most exhausting set before the end game, but we'll get to those. Upon saving Echo, the two have a heart-to-heart. Echo is actually a gigantic loser. He was an engineer who abandoned the USNC and has just been winging it, but Master Chief of all people assures him of his value that he kinda has, and promises to protect him. The themes at play become pretty immediately apparent if they hadn't been already. Weapon and Echo are Master Chief opening up to new people after losing Cortana. Some brief mentions of him not trusting Weapon are a little more subtle, but this scene kinda pounds you over the head and really just lays into you that Master Chief needs to move on and trust people again. Honestly, it's a little weird, but as far as trying to tell a story goes, it at least has some kind of emotional core, development, and even a little bit of well-placed heart at times. After this, the last part of the open world is opened up, the final section and a new bunch of side stuff to do. 5 more forward operating bases, 2 outposts, 1 distress call, and 8 high value targets. If you've been wondering where the variants for the human weapons are, they're around, just hidden in the overworld, but once they're obtained they can be replicated at forward operating bases just like the banished ones that you get from the high value targets. The sequence will likely be the longest mission in the game, depending on how much you engage with the side content. The second Command Spire is locked down, and to enter Master Chief needs to go to 4 beacons spread pretty distantly across the open world. Banshees first become available here, and is probably the first flying vehicle you'll have access to unless you grinded out a lot of side content to unlock the Hornet, the USNC equivalent. The starting area, which is also the ending area, has an interesting layout at least, with some kind of ruined village built into the cliffs, but by the time you wrap around to it, you'll be worn out by the beacons. Individually, each is just some combat. One of them has hunters and high-ranking elites that abuse active camo and swords, which is a bit much for one stop of 4, but largely it's more the same, and if you're like me, there's going to be a lot of distractions between them. Especially as this is the final mission before the point of no return until the story concludes. No more open world for a while. Returning to the Spire is a bit much. More hunters, monsters, lots of suicide grunts, and it really starts to highlight one of the negatives of the open world in a way: time, space, and lots of filler. The Nexus, a different internal part of the ring, serves as the next mission. Honestly, there's not a lot to say on the gameplay, it's more the same, it's still good, but there's not a lot being introduced. Hunters come up more and more, but this mission here is mostly just to move the story forward. In case you missed the themes earlier, and you probably didn't, when Weapon attempts to hack the Nexus, the Harbinger attempts to corrupt her, and Master Chief immediately tries to delete her. Honestly, given what happened with Cortana, he seems to be in the right to do so, but Weapon can somehow prevent her own deletion. Seems like something you might want to program out given the Cortana thing. Speaking of Cortana, we see a lot of her now. Seeing how she died under the Zeta Halo, fragments of her data and memory linger around. It's undoubtedly extremely contrived, but it's used throughout this final stretch to fill in the gaps between the opening and Master Chief waking up a half year later. She's been a busy girl working with Atriox a bit, but also destroying the Brood homeworld, among other various war crimes. The Command Spire continues as you'd expect. Weapon is a bit standoffish with Chief for now. She's still the strongest character in the story because it's pretty reasonable for her to feel a little mad after his attempted murder, even if he was probably doing the right thing, and the gameplay progresses as normal. Near the top of the spire, a Jutton resolution reappears. The boss fight is virtually identical. He can summon in sentinels, which are actually a bit of a blessing, as sentinel beams do wonders against him. The stage layout is a bit iffy. You'll spend most of your time circling the central pillar, but the actual boss mechanics are still fairly strong. At the top, after shutting down the spire, a ghost shows up. Not like Casper, they're Covenant dropships with heavy cannons. They're pretty fun to fight, not actually as frustrating as you'd expect. A few skewer and launcher shots puts them down. A little tougher when the additional two show up, but also a nice reward for getting through actually killing resolution. Another Spartan killer catches the Pelican and captures Echo, and despite the obvious trap, Master Chief has Weapon teleport them to the repository, as close as she can get them to where Echo is held. The repository is designed like a late game Halo level. Sentinels everywhere, piles of elites and brutes. It's all still good, all still a bit tiring by now. The big thing that happens here is more Cortana stuff, specifically that Weapon is revealed to be her clone, a fresh save of Cortana if you will, only lacking her memories. I mean, only is a bit of an understatement given how much that's clearly shaped Cortana. Like I said, Weapon is really different, cheery and optimistic. I like her better than Cortana as someone to play off Master Chief. Weapon takes the news a bit too Jurassically given how obvious it was and offers to kill herself, which Chief refuses despite his mistrust 2 chapters ago. It's sudden, but it makes sense thematically for what they're going for, given the focus on his developing relationships with her and Echo throughout the game. We also find out what happened to Cortana, a sudden surge of regret that led to her deleting herself and blowing up Atriox. After getting back above ground, the road begins, the obligatory vehicle level. These kind of bounce back and forth in quality between games. The road is a bit on the lesser end. I mean, don't get me wrong, rampaging in a Wraith is fun, but vehicles feel like they die extremely fast in this game, probably because instead of getting them at only specific points, you can make them in any forward operating base. Feels like you can only clear one segment of the road, maybe a little more, before the Wraith is done, and eventually you'll run out and be left on foot to mow through the extremely large remainder that the game clearly intended you to use the vehicles for. Granted, eventually you will have to step out into the messiest, largest overworld battle arena, loaded with hunters, snipers, elites, and brutes, in order to lower the bridge, but the longer you can have a vehicle, the better. The vehicles are fun while they last. The final area is a pretty solid mess though. It's a lot to deal with, it's a lot of enemies. The House of Reckoning is probably the most creative setting a Halo level has ever had. While it appears to be another banished tower, it actually serves as a training facility to their forces, divided into 4 floors. The first 2 are really cool training rooms, which center around life-size dioramas for training, broken USNC vehicles and miniature buildings, plus targets scattered around. It's a really great setting, but staying in the center really isn't optimal in the slightest. It's pretty much completely unviable on heroic or legendary, with the edges providing much more solid, consistent cover, which kind of puts the setting to waste. The 3rd floor is a boss fight against the Spartan killer, the elite Jega Rodomani. The area is compact, closed off, 2-story armory, whereas special energy sword the Bloodblade, which like the duelist sword boosts speed and jump height, but even further, is incredibly dangerous. He also has always on active camo, and when his shield breaks, he somehow stops being detectable even by sensors to run away and heal. Honestly, I beat him by mashing through all my grenades and spamming BR rounds into him while he was stunned. It felt like shit and wasn't interesting, but the supreme tedium of breaking his shield and getting maybe a handful of additional shots in before he basically warps away and fully heals while getting one-shotted wasn't for me. The top floor is where Echo is held, and the leader of the banished Escharum waits. Even compared to the previous one, this is truly a miserable boss fight, easily the worst one. His health bar is immense, there's plenty of weapons around, and you're gonna need them. It just goes on and on. It's not even difficult. He runs around with a scrap cannon. You grapple shot away, shoot a bit, repeats. Thank Christ he doesn't have a shield. After a solid 10 minutes of taking battle rifle rounds to the face, he puts up a shield, and you need to break some things to bring it down. Then you repeat the first bit for another 10 minutes. Then you do it a third time, but he switches to a gravity hammer. It feels endless. You seem to get a checkpoint between each portion of the fight, thankfully, but it's just not fucking fun. It takes an age no matter what you do. Escharum is insistent throughout the battle that the fight will become legend. I certainly doubt humans or brutes in the future will tell tales of the time Master Chief shot Escharum in the face for 25 straight minutes. I do like the moment they have at the end where Chief, despite everything, shows empathy for Escharum, being in the same position he is, a soldier doing what he thinks is right. It's a completely understandable position for him to take, and it's a nice wrap-up to the banished conflict. But there's still one more thing to deal with. The Harbinger is still doing something in the Silent Auditorium, and probably needs to be stopped. We're not ever really given a good reason why, but I guess she worked with the banished, so... A majority of the last level, Silent Auditorium, is just combat tests. Hunters in a tiny room, sentinels, brutes, elites, sentinels, snipers, sentinels. So let's cut to the chase. What is the Harbinger doing? She is both sending a signal to somewhere, we're never told where, even after the fight, and trying to free the other members of her species, the Endless, from a prison the Forerunners sealed them in under the Silent Auditorium. The Endless apparently are immune to the effects of the ring firing, the pulse of which wipes out every other form of advanced life. How do they survive it? I don't know. Will it ever be explained? Probably in, like, some stupid book or something. I don't know. The Harby fight rivals Esharum's, primarily because it follows the worst style of fights that these games can have. You fight a gigantic wave of enemies in a large circular area with minimal cover, where you're always surrounded, and once all of them are dealt with, which will take a few tries most of the time because it just throws 100 enemies at you in a room with almost nothing to hide behind. Then you blast away at Harby while dodging her one-shot attacks, get a checkpoint, and repeat. Each wave is progressively harder, with the last having a max-level brute with a shield chasing you constantly holding a hammer, while elites and skimmers with snipers one-shot you. It's probably the hardest fight in the game, and it gets really old losing to the brute chieftain every 15 seconds. Despite killing the Harbinger, she managed to send a message somewhere. Presumably this will be followed up in the next game, I guess. Master Chief and Weapon escape and find out 3 days have passed due to, something. And Weapon renames herself Cortana, while the post-credit scene shows that Atriox is still alive and working to keep the Endless sealed away. Which, given the alliance with the Harbinger, I don't really get what the Banished want or what the Endless are besides magic, I guess? There's no good reason they should be immune to the ring, there's no good reason that they're psychics, and besides the one Endless we've seen being fairly powerful but killable, we're not given a good reason to assume their release would be something catastrophic or worse than a multi-dimensional hive mind zombie invasion. How much could there even be sealed away inside of the Zeta Halo? A few million, maybe? They're strong, but they're not that strong. They still die to bullets. It's a good campaign usually. Its issues are also its strengths. The open world can be really fun to explore, getting around with the zipline is wild, and the gunplay is amazing, but when you're just trying to move on, it can get very tedious. The side stuff can be good, the optional bosses are usually pretty great, but much of the other stuff, like forward operating bases, are pretty repetitive. The game is definitely strongest in the linear parts, not just hallways and straight lines, but moving down wide chunks of open world in a way where you're being challenged and pushed forward. Creativity and improvisation really shine in this game, especially with the gadgets. Grapple shot, you're always just grappling for whatever you need. It keeps things fast and frantic. I think I love that portion of the game. There's a lot to love, even the story to an extent, despite how disjointed it is, tries to tell some kind of emotional story, which is definitely the stronger part than the Endless thing, which is confusing. Maybe it'll make more sense in the future, but I'm not gonna read 8 books to understand what the fucking Endless do. To speak on multiplayer, I need to lead in with the awkwardness of the monetization. It's a fucking mess. The multiplayer component of Halo Infinite is free to play. Even if you buy the campaign, you gain almost nothing in the multiplayer, just a couple cosmetics that can be found throughout the open world. The game is doing the usual season pass thing that games like Fortnite have. The only thing that changes in each season pass, which go for $10 every 6 months, is the ability to use cosmetics you've unlocked. You can still unlock them, but they're off limits without a pass, which is fucking shitty. And a lot of them are exclusive to currency you can only earn through buying the season pass. This is pretty standard nowadays, but it's incredibly frustrating to buy the campaign for full price and be treated like the free-to-play 9-year-old, especially because all the customization unlocking used to just be a part of the game. Leveling up after a solid game and seeing item unlocked bypass to use is a fucking eye roll. Free-to-play also brings in a messy community. I've been on a lot of teams with screeching 10-year-olds. I mean, it was also true of the older games, but to a much lesser extent because there was something in the way of them playing, like they had to get their parents to buy the game. The reward system also leads to some obnoxious fucking teammates. Challenges appear 3 at a time, selected randomly, and you'll very often see teammates playing intentionally badly because challenges advance them to things they want faster. Camping out for specific weapons, running around spamming melee, ignoring objectives or kills, which makes random matchmaking a gigantic pain where you're on a 50-50 at best if your teammates even want to complete the objectives. Despite now entering Season 2 as of early May 2020, the game still doesn't feel very done either. There's only seasonal progression, no career progression. Campaign co-op and Forge, a map building mode, are announced for eventually, but with no real indication of when we'll see those basic features from past games. It's tiring. It's tiring. Getting past the pains of free-to-play and modern game design, the multiplayer is great. A lot of the classic modes are there. Slayer, the basic deathmatch, Capture the Flag, Oddball, which is kind of a variant on Capture the Flag, where each team needs to hold onto the skull for a full cumulative minute while being tracked by the other team. I suppose in a way it's kind of like a mobile King of the Hill. Some cool new ones like Total Control, which is exclusive to big team battles, where teams of 12 need to hold 3 control points simultaneously to win. Variety is a little slimmer than previously. There's no Griffball or zombies, but there's still quite a few modes. The focus on 4 versus 4 makes sense. Esports are huge right now, and they generate a lot of money, and they want to make the game competitive, but for me it's always going to be about big team, 12 versus 12. Goofier, vehicle focused. For people good at games, maybe 4 versus 4 has the appeal, but I'd rather have the chaos. Vehicles are really fun and kind of get sidelined in Infinite's campaign. Like, you can use them to get around the open world, but they're just not all that useful a lot of the time. Besides that, you also get a chance to fill a Warthog with 3 people, hop some jumps, and blast away at a group of other players, which is very satisfying. The current map selection is honestly fairly slim. As of Season 2's 2 new maps, the game has 12, 8 4 versus 4 maps, and 4 big team maps. The maps that are there are great. I'm glad they didn't solely limit themselves to places from the campaign or even on the Zeta Halo, with a few on Earth, desert areas, busy inner cities, a USNC training hall, a rocket base. There's a ton of variety, and thanks to gadgets like the grapple shot, these maps can feature a good amount of verticality. No giant spires like Reach and its jetpacks, but layered battlefields and little shortcuts are everywhere. Lots of quality of life changes exist in learning maps too. Map knowledge was always important, especially when it came to power weapon spawns like rocket launchers, and these are now marked on the HUD slightly before they spawn, which has the fun side effect of centralizing combat in those areas. Other weapon spawns can also be highlighted using the visor by pressing down to show nearby stuff, so it's no longer necessary to monkey around in empty maps to find the stuff you like. It's a really good multiplayer experience, and I think the fact that it's free makes it warrant at least a try. The already great shooting shines really well in all these amazing maps, the gameplay is really fun, the community can be a bit shit. The big team stuff is great. If you're into esports, you'll probably enjoy the 4 versus 4. The monetization stuff is scummy as fuck, but it's how games are now. For other side modes, there's a brief tutorial and some shooting challenges. That is, learning how to use each weapon in shooting galleries and trying to get high scores. They're alright, I don't have a lot to say about them. The tutorial mode, I suppose, is helpful for beginners in learning the new mechanics, and the shooting galleries are, yeah. I think I've kind of already concluded both halves of Halo Infinite on their own, but I suppose I'll close out here. The campaign is a lot of fun, although the fact that the campaign alone is $60 makes it a rocky recommendation. The story is a mess, although I think the characters really work. The gunplay is great, but the size and length is going to burn you out near the end, so at least it did for me. Visually, it's fucking spectacular, and the grapple shot is a joy, but I don't know if that's enough to recommend it. For Halo fans, definitely, although they would have already bought it. It's a massive improvement on the series after a few pretty large missteps, but overall I think I'm on the edge of it. I think it's really good, but not amazing, and with the multiplayer being free, maybe wait for a sale. The multiplayer is 100% worth trying. It's scummy as fuck, but the scumminess is pretty limited to cosmetics, and hopefully as it goes on it'll be filled in with more modes and maps. What is there is pretty great, but even this deep in, it still falls short of the amount of modes, customization, and content of pretty much all of the older Halo games. I'm hopeful for the future, and I'll keep diving in, but even now it's a really good time. Also 343, please add more big team maps. Thanks.